Hi everyone, my name is Chris Hart and I'm associated with Manchester University Press, and I'm delighted that you're joining us for what promises to be an excellent book launch with David Whyte and Grace Blakeley. Everyone at the Press is excited about bringing you today's event, but before I jump in, I'd like to do some housekeeping. So firstly, thank you to everyone who's tuned in and watching this live and interactive book launch. On your screen you should see an event dashboard containing the option to raise questions. This is for you to type in questions throughout the talk, which David and Grace will eventually get around to answering during the Q&A section at the end of the event. So please do ask questions, because from the events we've already done, I know that the authors really enjoy the sort of participation, interactive element to these talks. So as a brief introduction to today's panel, David Whyte is the author of Ecocide, Kill the Corporation Before It Kills Us. He's also a professor of socio-legal studies at the University of Liverpool and has written a number of excellent books on austerity and corruption in the UK, as well as contributed to the likes of Open Democracy, The Guardian, The Herald, and Red Pepper. Joining David today is host Grace Blakeley. Grace is staff writer at Tribune magazine, host of the Our World to Win podcast, and author of Stolen: How to Save the World from Financialisation, and a new book due out this autumn, The Corona Crash: How the Pandemic Will Change Capitalism. She's also the editor of another forthcoming book, Futures of Socialism, the Pandemic and the Post-Corbyn Era, also out this autumn. So it goes without saying that Manchester University Press is delighted to be the publisher of David's book, Ecocide. It is a book that lays bare the dire ecological consequences of corporate capitalism and sends out a powerful rallying call to all activists and academics alike. So without any more intro from me, I'm now going to hand over to David and Grace for a discussion on the book and how it fits into the current thinking and political landscape.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that lovely introduction. And yeah, hello everyone, and thank you so much for being here tonight to discuss David Whyte's brilliant new book, Ecocide. I'm delighted to have been sent a copy very early on and to have given it an endorsement, and also to be hosting this event tonight, because I think it's a really, really important contribution. So yeah, I'm going to be hosting tonight's event, and David and I are going to be discussing some of the themes in his book and how they relate to our current political and economic context. Whilst we're going to have an amazing discussion tonight, I would encourage you still to go out and buy the book. It is well worth the read, and we will not cover everything that's in it this evening. So yeah, without much more introduction, I'm just going to hand over to, well, I'm going to begin asking some of these questions and give the floor to David. So the first question I wanted to ask you, David, is why your starting point is the corporation rather than capitalism as a whole, because this, is a book about the nature of modern capitalism. So, do you think that there's a danger in focusing on the corporation rather than the kind of holistic system that is capitalism, or do you think that's a kind of an important entry point that is often neglected in the literature?
Yeah, that's a good question. And can I just say hello to everyone? I was going to say it's good to see you all, but I can't see anyone apart from Grace right now, so I'll just kind of take it on trust that you're there. And just to say thanks for turning out for this, because it's after people have been on the computer all day at work, not many people here probably, it's not the easiest thing to just come and stare at this two-dimensional thing, so we'll try and make it try and bring it to life as much as possible. And thanks to Grace for this, and thanks also to Manchester University Press for hosting the event and publishing the book. Back to the question, I think it's a really good question, because it's a question I would probably ask in the sense that if you get rid of corporations, if you get rid of just the institutional form through which capitalism works, then are you not just still left with capitalism and a profit-oriented system? Is the problem not really actually that we're all geared up to a competitive profit-seeking system? And I think that is the case. But I also think it's almost too easy just to, and the great slogan that is maybe the most prominent slogan in the Fridays for Future, the school strikes movement that's emerged in the last year or so, is system change, not climate change. And I think that's a really powerful slogan. But I also think we need to kind of specify and concretize how we would achieve system change. And I do think, look, I think the book goes into why capitalism, and capital particularly, and starting from a Marxist perspective, argues that well, capital has this inbuilt drive to reproduce itself. And part of that inbuilt drive means it's insatiable. It can't be satisfied. It has to keep reproducing itself. And of course, the phrase that Marx used and that has been taken up by geographers is the annihilation of space by time, or time-space compression, what geographers call really what is really happening when we talk about globalization, that by capital concentrating its resources, it has to get over those barriers of time and space to keep reproducing itself. So that's a general point about the system. And of course, if you read other authors more recently have talked about the way that works in terms of the ecosystem, the annihilation of space by time is also the annihilation of nature, and has always been that. But the fact that the corporation is the key institutional form through which that takes place is not just a kind of a historical kind of significance. And if you look, so maybe one of the most widely read books on what's been going on, and the critical point we're at right now, the David Wallace Wells book, and I'm afraid I can't remember. I'm not conveniently forgetting, because we should just be talking about my book, but I can't remember
the Uninhabitable Earth, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
But he says, look, more than half of the CO2 in the air has been a result of industrial processes in the last 3 decades, right? So, if we take that as face value, then we think, well, is it a neoliberal problem? And obviously, neoliberalism is a problem because regulation of the environment has been undermined over these 3 decades. But there's also a much longer history. And crucial to that history is the corporation. The corporation was the institution which at the outset developed colonialism. I would argue that the slave trade colonialism wouldn't have transpired in the way it did without the corporation as a particular form of capital investment, the way in which private wealth was organized around a project, which ultimately was about destroying humanity in a broad sense, but it was if we think about the slave trade, it was genocidal, and in all other respects, it was also annihilating nature. And I'll maybe come back to that because I've been talking too much, but I think we need to specify the mechanism through which that happened. And the corporation, of course, is alive and well and controlling most of the things that are threatening our environment right now.
So usually when we think about the big corporations who are threatening our environment, we think about, ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, the big oil companies, maybe big chemical companies, maybe, companies effectively undertaking land grabs in the global south. You start each chapter with the story of wood pulp company Stora Enzo. That doesn't seem like a kind of intuitive choice. So can you tell us why you picked that example?
Yeah, I mean, look, Stora Enzo isn't big oil. I mean, in fact, most people here probably won't have heard of them. They are one of the biggest, as you say, wood pulp companies. They grow trees to produce paper ultimately, and they are kind of, you would think, the least likely target of a book like this. Their slogan, or their kind of their corporate byline is the renewable materials company. So they kind of style themselves as a kind of responsible company that's sustainable. Until you dig a bit deeper. So that's I think one reason to focus on them is to say, okay, well, here's a company that is renewable. Another reason is historically, Stora Enzo has its roots in a company called Stora Kopparberg, which some historians believe to be the first ever corporation. It was founded in the early 13th century to develop a copper mine in a place called Falun in Sweden. And so what happened over hundreds of years, as shares in this company passed through different hands, it ends up as Stora Enzo. So the world's first company still exists in a modern form. Now that raises big questions about actually the longevity of corporations, and a phrase that we're beginning to hear more and more now is that the planet's days are numbered. We can tell unless we take urgent action to limit climate change, unless the Paris Agreement is taken seriously, in 100 years' time we might have a planet that is unsustainable and days are numbered. But the corporation has an inbuilt mechanism which kind of makes it live forever. It can be that its shares can be passed down through the generations, and Stora Enso's a really good example of that. And if you look at actually what happened in Fallon in the copper mine, and I mean, it was the most important copper mine in Europe for centuries. Sorry, just indulge me for a bit while I get into the kind of obscure
No, this is all
details of the history of copper mining in Europe. But it stops actually producing in the 1990s. But right up until the 19th century, it was the most important mine for copper in Europe, probably. And of course, a lot of the land and the lakes are acidified around Fallon still, and the land has got very heavy metal concentrations and may not actually recover from that. And there's been some interesting kind of scientific work about that. So that's a kind of interesting observation. So the world's first corporation has kind of destroyed its immediate environment. And of course, Stora Enso will never be held accountable for that for a number of reasons, right? But the main reason is because it has this longevity as a corporation, which allows it to leave behind those things that economists call externalities. And if you look at what Stora Enso does now, I mean, it's in a relationship with a South American company, which makes it the biggest landowner in Uruguay right now. It plants eucalyptus plantations, which are renewable. But there's been major conflicts around the use of land, both in Uruguay and Brazil, with local landless peasant movement, because what eucalyptus does is it destroys biodiversity, even though it can be renewed and so on. So there's a huge controversy about what Stora Enso is doing now in a global sense. I mean, there's another reflection there. It would be impossible to describe. I mean, it's based in Helsinki now. It's a Finnish company, and to say that a Finnish company is perhaps the largest landowner in Uruguay, that's also saying something that we'll maybe come back to. But what's also, just to complete the circle of this story, if you go back to the same area in where Fallon is in Sweden, the county is called Dalarna, and there are now controversies around the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation has accused Stora Enso of destroying biodiversity in that immediate area where it's planting trees, where Stora Kopparberg came from. So there's an incredible circularity here that I think raises huge questions, not just about the ability of a company to continue to destroy its immediate environment, but the way in which accountability works and the way in which impunity seems to be built into that mechanism as well. Because at the end of the day, even if individuals are held to account for this, then the company, even if the company is held to account, it will be the company that's held responsible. It won't be the investors who over the years have profited from this. Certainly won't be the investors who will ever have to answer for the things I've described, and the directors won't either. So there's something very, very powerful about the corporation that gives it impunity. And Stora Enso, which looks like a fairly kind of innocuous, fairly green company, I think is a good example because, it's at one end of the spectrum. We don't even have to talk about big oil. We don't even have to talk about big agri, the chemical companies, to look at what the impact of corporations is.
You kind of hinted at this in your first answer, but you talk in the book about the role of a corporation in the development of colonialism, and that it's important to understand the role of a corporation in the development of colonialism in order to understand the modern corporation today. Can you talk a little bit more about why that is?
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of hidden history in a way. I mean, I think the Black Lives Matter movement did something that it's not maybe being recognised for. Pulling down the statue of Edward Colson, was significant for all kinds of reasons. But one thing it exposed was the Royal Africa Company, right? The fact that he was the head of a profit-making company that was actually the largest institution, the largest single organisation that traded slaves in the history of the slave trade. We know about the East India Company partly because if you've ever watched Pirates of the Caribbean, or what was the BBC Taboo, the BBC series, and so that's kind of in a little bit in our cultural kind of history, but colonial corporations generally aren't. And if you look at every European power, I mean, I was just talking about Sweden a minute ago. Sweden had its own colonial corporations. Denmark had its own colonial corporations. Germany, France, the Dutch. Britain did famously. I've mentioned a couple of them. And the reason that we had, and all of the European powers who were competing for territory and for trade, had those, was because it enabled private wealth to be used for what was essentially a state project. So the colonial corporations allowed investors certain privileges, a monopoly over rights to trade, or the monopoly over the right to occupy land or to exploit local people, whatever it was. They were granted that monopoly. They could combine their wealth, and that allowed it allowed the capacity. Actually, a capacity for violence. If you look at the history of those companies, the capacity for state violence in the colonial project to be hugely magnified in that sense. Now, it's not an argument that colonization wouldn't have happened without the colonial corporation, but it wouldn't have happened with the scale and intensity, and it wouldn't have been able to bring the nation's resources into one singular purpose, which was colonization. So it's something that we I think we forget. And of course, look at where that capital was invested, not just in trade, but in minerals, stripping of forests, gold, and all kinds of other plantations, which of course we're now kind of paying the price for in terms of their environmental destruction. So it goes back to the point I started off by saying, look, that annihilation of space by time, or time-space compression that David Harvey would maybe call it, was hugely enhanced by corporations, by the ability to organize private wealth for that purpose and concentrate wealth for that purpose. And of course, we can see it today. I mean, we could pick out all kinds of examples of what's happening in terms of neo-colonialism, but effectively, and you've written a lot more about this, Grace, that effectively the financial system now effectively facilitates the extraction of wealth from the global south to the global north, and much of that is resource wealth, much of that is wealth from the destruction of forests and so on. So that blueprint was really set in stone by the colonial corporation, and we have to recognise that, because precisely the same dynamic is going on today on a much larger scale, and in many ways even less controllable.
That's really interesting, because some of the work that I've been doing recently, and in the book that Chris mentioned at the beginning that I've got coming out soon, I talk a little bit about the role of the state in supporting capital accumulation via often supporting private corporations, and of central banks in propping up investors, propping up asset prices in order to protect wealth that's invested in financial markets and in corporate equities. So that continuation of those very close links between the state and private businesses seems to be quite an important theme that comes across here. I wanted to ask you kind of, so obviously, your solution is very much in the title, kill the corporation before it kills us. It's a very compelling, it's a very compelling ask. But a lot of people might come back at this and say, well, corporations are useful. They do all these, useful things. Why shouldn't we just regulate them or tax them a bit more, or try to constrain them in some way rather than completely abolishing them? Why did you go for that kind of more provocative solution to this question?
Yeah, look, I actually agree with that. Like most of the kind of answers that I've got, they're probably quite contradictory, because there is an inherent contradiction there, right? We do need to regulate. Clearly, we need to regulate corporations. And look, the COVID period has illustrated that more than before. I mean, the leeway that corporate lobbyists have had in this period. I mean, just to name a couple of examples. the coal tar sands was opened up in Canada, suddenly precisely because of corporate lobbying, and of course, you know, in that sense, the regulation of the oil industry in Alberta and in those parts of Canada is absolutely crucial. The Environmental Protection Agency in the US effectively had all of its enforcement suspended by the administration, and so that will have had huge consequences for local communities. And you know, in this country, one of the things that workers are demanding is action by the health and safety executive to protect people at work, because it's not been forthcoming, and even basic legal requirements on PPE have not been upheld, right? So I'm not denigrating the importance of regulation. It's absolutely crucial to have the state intervening to protect people and uphold the law, even just at a level that we would expect in a capitalist society. But it can't be a solution, and the reason it can't be a solution because effectively, and in some of the examples I've mentioned, you can see a kind of a dynamic in regulation that we don't often recognise, which is that regulation often contains, and I'm going to sound extreme again, but it often contains a license to kill, and by that I mean, you know, when you have most of the pollution in most of the industrial pollution in this country, almost all of it is licensed, right? And some of it, even the production of dioxins at levels that Friends of the Earth are constantly complaining about, is licensed by government. 10 miles away from where I'm sitting in Ellesmere Port, there's a plant that's still manufacturing lead to be added to petrol to be exported to Africa. Now that, you know, we've known for years, and in fact almost every country in the world has banned lead. We would never have it added to petrol here, but yet it has a license to do that. And I think, look, if we kind of think about regulation as a way in which governments don't just set the limits to control economic activity, they also open up the possibilities for what happens, right? So, and you know, I don't want to kind of get into the COVID period, but it's difficult to avoid some of the examples. I mean, just think about what has been the big regulatory effort in the COVID period. Probably the provision of funding for furloughing and the provision of loans, of bailout loans, to make sure that companies don't collapse. Now, obviously, we need to make sure that we protect jobs, but the way that funding was structured was to retain the autonomy of corporations. So all of the furloughing money went into the hands of HR departments in private companies, and we know that actually the hundreds of millions have gone to companies like British Airways, who've also sacked thousands of workers, you know, at the same time. So that form of regulation and intervention that is there to protect people is also protecting at the same time the autonomy of the corporation, and that's a problem. And it becomes a problem when you start to look at the chemical industry. And there's a list, and I go into it in the introduction to the book in a lot of detail. And it's only just a selective list, but it's incredible the number of deadly substances not only have been licensed and many of them still being sold. Leaded petrol is probably an example of one which is pretty much eradicated. But I'm going to think about, you know, if you think about some of the most deadly chemicals, the examples I go through: BPA, bisphenol B, and the plastic that's known to cause hormonal damage has been known to do that since the 20s. PCB, polychlorinated biphenyl. You'll realise that you'll find everyone knows now I'm not a chemist because I can't even pronounce the names of these. I'll just use the acronyms. PCB, I know what it is. It's a coolant lubricator, and it was known that was deadly from the late 60s at least. PVC from the 70s, organophosphates still being sold. Sales actually continuing to rise this year. Glyphosate, the chemical that's in Monsanto's Roundup that they've just had to shell out a multi-million settlement. In all of those cases, and this is detailed in the book, you find that when those things are discovered, when the deadly effects of those things are discovered, either by scientists in universities or by corporate scientists themselves, there's immediately a cover-up, right? The whole Volkswagen diesel emissions thing, it makes that look like Volkswagen were being relatively honest. I mean, the incredible effort that corporations go to distort, cover up, sow the seeds of doubt in all of those examples that I've used, and as I say, I go into the book, it's absolutely incredible. And behind that, there is always an effort to lobby governments for easier regulation, for regulation which may limit the concentration of some of these substances, but ultimately allows them to be produced and then reproduced. So this idea of a license to kill is, I think, really, really significant, and we haven't taken it seriously enough as a society, also for thinking about climate change and production of hydrocarbons. And so the last chapter in the book before the conclusion talks about endpoint regulation. We regulate those things generally at the end point of the production process, and that's because it allows corporations to control the production of these things, right? I'm oversimplifying, right? But essentially that's what we need to. So we need to think about regulating at the start point. And if we're regulating at the start point, then we need to strip away the autonomy of corporations. We need to strip away the autonomy of organizations to profit from these things. And the only way to do that, and we know this from the history of all these things, is to take away the privileges, the exceptional privileges that corporate power is based on, the privileges that allow investors to profit with impunity, and senior managers, CEOs to make decisions which are focused entirely on maximizing value for shareholders. There was an example in the New York Times, I'll just finish on this to illustrate the point. There was an example in the New York Times which I think crystallizes why we need to control the corporation here. The New York Times exposed this story of how the oil companies in the US were lobbying, using their incredible lobbying power to get changes to the trade deal that was being done with Kenya so that they could increase the export of plastics to Kenya. And that essentially is to make up for revenue loss that they're anticipating through the production of oil. So we're at a point where if that autonomy, that form of regulation is allowed to exist, then we'll simply be replacing oil with plastics. And I don't think there's a better example of that.
Thanks so much, David. So there's some really compelling examples there. The other one that came to my mind was I watched a film the other day, Dark Waters, with Mark Ruffalo, about the kind of Teflon scandal and about the fact that the Teflon company knew that they were putting these poisonous chemicals into the water all around the US, and the US is of course one of the worst offenders here. So obviously there's a lot to be concerned about there, particularly when it comes to this trade deal that Boris Johnson really wants to do with the US. So all these issues are so germane to where we are today. Now I'm going to give everyone else a chance to ask some questions. Sorry. So I think, Chris, have you been monitoring the questions that have been popping up in the discussion?
I have, Grace. Yeah, we've got some actually excellent questions that come through. So I'm going to jump in. I will add, if people do want to ask more questions, feel free to type them in as we're going through this Q&A section. Also, I won't call out anyone's name who's raised the question. I will acknowledge, but because you haven't given me permission, then I won't raise it just in case it causes an issue. So the first one is how do you see the role of state institutions and state-owned corporations in the event of ecocide?
Yeah, I mean, I think that pinpoints a really difficult question to answer, because obviously I'm not positioning a kind of form of state capitalism or state corporation against, and I mean one of the things, and obviously this book's coming from a left perspective, and I think one of the failures of the left, if we go back to before our time anyway, go back to the 60s, one of the failures of the left was not to have a critique of nationalization, which said we need democratic control over over production, over whether it's the production of our energy, over transport, and over the infrastructure, because it's clear that having large corporations on that kind of scale without any kind of democratic accountability is going to cause problems. And of course, when the Thatcher government's reformed and privatized and sold everything off, I think the left was not very well equipped to offer alternatives. So I do think that's a very hard discussion to have, but there are good examples of where energy production is decentralized and people have some kind of local say over how they use their energy and how their energy is supplied. But I do think we need to think a lot more about also the control and the power that workers have. And the preface to the book, which was written after COVID, kind of begins to talk a bit about the Green New Deal and what a Green New Deal might mean. And look, it's an example that is reeled out, I think, by the left a lot, but it's actually quite incredible when you look at it. The Lucas Aerospace example. So what happened in the 1970s when there was pressure on the UK defence industry, and particularly on this company Lucas Aerospace, instead of just simply demanding that the state takes over and runs the company, what workers did was produce a kind of blueprint for transforming the company from being an arms company into being socially useful, to shifting from socially destructive products to socially useful products. But the reason it's quite an incredible example is I'll just give two examples, but the wind turbines, they were using the same engineering know-how that they had and expertise that they had to develop weapons. They produced a prototype for a wind turbine that's widely used now. They produced the prototype for a heat pump to recycle heat and to keep houses warm in a sustainable way that's now widely used today. Now that came from workers searching for alternatives themselves. So I think if there's something that we need to contemplate as well, is how we have some kind of democratic control in our workplaces that don't create those huge behemoths. And of course, I would argue that private profit-making corporations are partly particularly threatening our existence and threatening the planet because of the profit motive. But if you have large state behemoths, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to harness all of our energy and the expertise of people that work for these companies for human benefit, for socially useful products rather than socially destructive products. So look, I'm giving that answer that's not really in the book. I mean, I do say that in the book, but I don't set out how that needs to be done. But I do think we need a conversation, and I think, you know, the Labour Party under Corbyn was beginning that conversation. I'm not making a party political broadcast here, but I think that conversation was being begun, and that's where we need to go to think about sustainability, not just to a state-owned model.
Thanks, David. A couple of questions here have had to come in looking at the alternatives. So what your suggestions alternatives? Do you want to just talk about the end chapter, the manifesto, in a little detail, and just point to some of the examples you give there?
Yeah, well, it's not really a manifesto, but it does pinpoint two or three things, and I talked about the exceptional privileges that investors have, and you know, I think a key privilege that we don't kind of think about enough is limited liability. So, I mean, it's an incredible advantage that you can have as an investor, that you invest in shares, and you don't even have to know where that money's going. You don't even have to know where the money is. Never mind, or what it's doing. All you will ever risk is the sum that you invest. So, in terms of that gamble, which has huge stakes in terms of the costs that come back on us, that principle of limited liability is the inbuilt kind of institutional mechanism that stops investors paying for the consequences of their profit-making activity. So that's one thing that I think has to end. And I do talk about, well, you know, I do make, and it's very difficult because we don't live in a system where we can rely on the law to reform and to transform things for us. But there are basic principles that I think that already exist in law that we can adapt. So one of the things I talk about is look, if a so-called organised criminal, I mean, I would argue that a lot of what we're talking about tonight is organised crime, but if what would not be called in normal part, the kind of organised criminals the police go after, if they're caught, then the courts have the ability to seize their funds, right? Seize the funds because they're made from either immoral or illegal activities. Now, I think we're at a stage, if we're serious about saving the planet, then we have to be saying there are particular things that you cannot make profit from, right? Okay, one minor example might be selling lead to, and I can't remember which North African country, and I don't think it's confirmed which North African country that the Ellesmere Port plant sells lead to. That's not maybe the biggest example, but it is if you're a child in North Africa, right? And you're exposed to these things. I think there's certain principles that we can set down and say you cannot profit from things that are knowingly destroying the planet, and if you do that, then your funds will be seized, and your ability to be the kind of guardian of those resources or those processes or whatever it is will be withdrawn. And there's an interesting debate about this in the States just now. There's a discussion about the corporate death penalty, and whether when corporations commit crimes in their corporate guise, when corporate persons commit crimes, then they should be prevented from doing so. And one way of doing that is the corporate death penalty, literally to seize all their assets. Now, again, that's a third discussion in the concluding chapter in the book. The problem with that, of course, is that very often the fallout, the costs are paid by ordinary people who had nothing to do with the corporate crimes in the first place. So workers lose their jobs, creditors lose their money, and so on. But there is another way of dealing with this, which I think is really useful, and I think the time has come for this idea, and it's called investor fines or equity fines. And what that involves is that investors, when things when there's a crime, or I would argue if there is profiteering from environmentally destructive activities, then you can fine companies in another way, which targets the shareholder. The court reissues a certain number of shares. It's called an equity fine. So 30%, say, of the value of the company is reissued as shares, and those shares can be given to workers or the community or the state or whatever. Now, one of the questions the book raises is, are we not at the point where we can gradually introduce this kind of mechanism to take over the companies that are killing the planet and put those companies back in the hands of the people, rather than in the hands of a bunch of anonymous investors who never have to pay for the consequences of what they're doing and never even have to know where the profits are coming from. So it's not a manifesto, but there are some ideas in how we begin to dismantle the legal basis for the corporation, and think about dismantling the structure of corporate capitalism in that way.
Thanks, David. Okay, so here's a question. Grace, feel free to answer this one as well, because it relates back to your new books coming out. So do you think the changes people have made over the last few months, so reduced consumption, obviously less travel, will lead to long-term change with regards to corporations, or do you think there'll be a bounce back at some point with corporations, or that, what's the long-term future for corporations?
Did you want me to? Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think the biggest, the thing that my book looks at in particular depth is, as I said, the kind of growing interrelationships that go back for a while, but are becoming increasingly important for the basic functioning of capitalism between private corporations and the state, and actually private corporations, private financial institutions, and the state. I think what we've seen over the course of this pandemic is that, you know, there's been a huge threat to the existence, basically, of a huge number of corporations, predominantly smaller and medium-sized businesses. And that threat was kind of compounded by the fact that, you know, over the last 10 years, we've had a huge amount of cheap debt that's been created, a huge amount of liquidity that's been pumped into the financial system in the form of kind of asset purchases by central banks. And that's basically given a bunch of different corporations a lifeline that has allowed them to hang on much longer than they otherwise might have. So we had all these kind of zombie corporations that were just massively over indebted. The pandemic came and it threatens, you know, a huge proportion of corporations all over the world, really, because, you know, a lot of them have margins that are small enough that if they lose revenue for a couple of months, they won't be able to pay back their debts. And, you know, then all those assets go into the hands of creditors, and actually ultimately they're probably bought up by larger corporations, and you get the acceleration of this process of monopolization, which only ultimately increases dramatically corporate power, as we're seeing kind of most dramatically with the US, with the tech companies in the US. So to prevent this kind of massive contraction in the number of companies, you saw the state step in and use really all the power that it has available to it to continue these corporations' lives, as David might put it, to make sure that they wouldn't die. So that was the Fed, you know, offering various forms of loans to different businesses, same with the Bank of England, same with the ECB, the Bank of Japan. It was all those banks purchasing assets to make it cheaper for big companies to borrow. It was the governments directly providing loans to those companies. And in a lot of these cases, these loans and these benefits have gone to corporations that are not only producing things that are actively bad and harmful for the world, but companies that then went on to lay off workers and pay out huge dividends, for example. Ben Smoke has a really interesting investigation into this phenomenon in the UK in Huck magazine, where he basically just dives into all of the corporations who've received this funding and shows that a huge number of them paid out big bonuses, paid out big dividends immediately after receiving this government funding. So you've got these really close links between big business and corporations, and that says nothing about the way in which those links are mediated by the financial system, which is, you know, you've got a couple of senior executives of some of the biggest banks in the world, a couple of senior executives of the biggest corporations in the world. They're all mates with one another, they lend to each other, they, you know, the banks do the IPOs for the big private companies, they facilitate investment into those companies, they often invest directly in those companies themselves. You've got these really strong links between all these different institutions. And in that context, you know, the pandemic is only going to increase that. In that context, we reached a point of how on earth can we actually start thinking about doing some of the things that are in David's book? How do we start really thinking about delivering this manifesto, really challenging the power and the dominance of the corporation? And, you know, I think that a lot of the mechanisms that you propose are fascinating and well worth exploring. The thing that comes to my mind is we need a movement that's going to champion those things as well. Is how do you push back against that? And this is the activist talking rather than, you know, I'm speaking to a bunch of academics, so maybe this isn't gonna resonate as much. But for me, the thing that comes out is, right, we need a movement that's going to champion this stuff, because how do you confront that level of organised, concerted power? You have to have a bit of power from below.
Yeah, there has to be social power, actually.
Yeah.
Not just the power of argument. Yeah, it's pointless unless there's social power. Look, I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, one thing I do think that is kind of, it's very, very just passing kind of mentioned in the book, and it deserves a lot more attention. Is, look, I think there are profound questions for trade unions here. I'm not saying trade unions are the only social movements, but actually, particularly some of the new trade unions, the IWGB and the UVW have directly confronted corporate power in a way that I think is savvy to some of the arguments that I've been making. But I will say one thing. I think that, you know, when you're a worker and you're negotiating or trying to bargain or even going on strike against your employer, for most of us that means going on strike against a corporation, against a corporate person, right? So, you know, and of course the trade union has a similar kind kind of personality, but when it comes down to what my contractual rights are, they're with my employer. They're with the kind of abstract corporate person. So I think, you know, everything in terms of the power that we're talking about in the economy, but also in the workplace, stems from that relationship. And I completely agree with Grace. There's no way we're going to get any reform of the corporation, no matter how mild, unless it's backed up with social power and probably a very high degree of class struggle, actually. So I think that's absolutely right. That's where the real debate is. The real battle for ideas is actually the struggle for social power.
Okay, great. Thanks both. So I'm going to ask two final questions now, and then we'll wrap up. So is there an opportunity, so with the international spread of Black Lives Matter, a renewed interest in colonial racial reparations, to leverage action against the present and historical damage of corporations? And my other one is just, actually, he says you know him, so Steve Toombs has asked if you could just talk about the title in a bit more detail and your choice of Ecocide as a title.
Oh yeah, thanks, Steve. End on an easy one there. Yeah, but I'll deal with the Black Lives Matter thing first, which is I think, again, I mean, I kind of touched on this before, the discussion about Colson's relationship with the Royal African Company, and indeed Rhodes' relationship. You know, the discussion about Rhodes' statue, his relationship or his leading role in the British South Africa Company and in De Beers. So clearly there's big links to be made there, but they have to also be made by the mode of neo-colonial domination by corporations. And it's, in a way, it's not enough just to get an apology, is it? You know, we know that all of the major banks, Barclays, the RBS, majority owned by us as taxpayers, has its roots in slave traders, and in you know, in the same way I was describing the kind of lineage from Stora Kopparberg to Stora Enzo, exactly the same lineage through those companies exists certainly in Barclays, and in the other banks, the big individual slave traders. There's a lineage there. So I think I've forgotten momentarily. There's a great database, and I've forgotten momentarily where it is, but there's a database which is looking at the legacy of British companies in the slave trade and where the profits were made. So I think a movement like that has to also be about justice now, racial justice now, and justice in global terms now, because you know, the extraction of wealth from the global south right now is really the motor force that's driving the ecocide. And even if we were just thinking about COVID, I mean, there's a lot of evidence now about how pushing back the frontiers of forest lands combined with factory farming is hugely increasing the ability of new pathogens to emerge, which can move from wherever it is, bats to humans, and where livestock can transmit. And the most corporatized sectors are in pigs, in pig farming, and in poultry. And so it's not a coincidence that two of our most recent epidemics were swine flu and bird flu, because the conditions through which those pathogens kind of emerge are the conditions of corporate capitalism, and they're the conditions that are also exploiting wealth, because it's big companies that are going into these places to exploit and to mine and to harvest or to cut down forests. So I think the demand for racial justice can definitely be sharpened with an awareness of the history of companies, but also a knowledge of the present of the precisely the same companies engaged in very similar exploitative practices. In terms of ecocide, look, there is a discussion about whether we should have a crime of ecocide, and in many ways that's the point of departure, you know, for the book. What would it mean to be prosecuting those who are responsible for the ecocide in a legal sense? And I think these demands are really, really important, But if anything, the purpose of this book, and Steve, who asked the question, knows this because we've talked about it a lot over the years, that we do need the kind of we need the kind of the moral condemnation of the law. So I think it's important to talk about the crime of ecocide, but also realise that that won't solve our problems. That ultimately the problems are in the structures of corporate capitalism. So yes, I'm in favour of all those movements who are demanding that in the International Criminal Court there should be a law of ecocide, and that maybe some of our CEOs in our companies could end up in the International Criminal Court. But I think that's it, possibly an even more distant prospect than seeking struggle, which overcomes those oppressive structures that we've talked about tonight. So, in a nutshell, the book does have a gentle critique of those movements for ecocide, while at the same time identifying the real motor engine of the ecocide.
Okay, thanks, David. And thanks, Grace. I think it's obviously a good time now. We'll wrap up. I just want to extend my thanks to both of you for participating today. I also just want to thank everyone who's attended, particularly everyone who's raised a question. We've had a lot of questions, and unfortunately, we've not had time to answer them all. David, we may want to, I'll bring out the questions, I'll extract them, and we may want to look at them and look at ways in which we can answer them through social media. There's a lot of good questions. I think the various jumping off points just shows the level of interest in this subject. I'll wrap up now, but just to say, obviously, David's book is now out. Grace, I think your new book's are out in October time, November time. So plenty of good reading there for everyone. Just keep the conversation going. And the activism...
Hey, Chris, I think you forgot to mention the books. The books are £5 to everyone who's here tonight.
Yes, that's true, David.
That's just a cheeky wee kind of just throw that in.
And can I just say, having received an early copy, it's excellent, and you have to buy it.
It is true, actually. You're right. Sorry, everyone will tomorrow receive an email from Manchester University Press containing the discount that David just mentioned. Also, we've recorded this event, so the event will send out the recording on social media and email sometime this week once we've managed to download it and edit it. But yeah, just to say thanks to you both, thanks David, thanks Grace. Really enjoyed this. I appreciate the time you've given.
Thanks,
Chris. Thanks, David. Good night.
Take care.